This video is sponsored by Best Buy and the Lenovo Yoga Book 9i. Stay tuned until later in this video to learn more. Honestly, I had no idea. I knew there was a free version of Fresco, but I thought there were a lot of strings attached to that, but there really aren't. Not only that, I thought that you needed a full Creative Cloud subscription in order to use Fresco with all of those features. Hello, my name is Brad. I review tech for creative professionals, and I've been sleeping on Adobe Fresco. I was really hesitant to recommend it to people. If it's a bonus to people who already have a Creative Cloud membership, then yes, absolutely, go ahead and use it. But for years, I thought it was just way too expensive to tell people, hey, check this thing out. But I was totally wrong. There's a lot of reasons to love this software, and I have made a list of them. So let's start with that obvious one. Number one, the price. Like I said at the top, there is a free version of this app, and I assumed that there were a lot of caveats to that, but there's only a few. Let me jump in here and create a new document and show you. Basically, you have access to everything except a handful of brushes. If I tap on my pixel brushes, I have a lot here. I have my basic brushes, like my hard round brushes and that sort of thing. I have charcoal, dry media, some inking, some lettering, some markers, that sort of thing. The only two categories that you don't have access to in the free version are the comic brushes, which have a lot of like halftones and crosshatches and things like that, and also the effects brushes, which has things like foliage and ink splats and stuff like that. The other big caveat is you cannot import any Photoshop brushes into Fresco. That is one of the superpowers of this app that you won't have access to, at least in the free version. So what I'm going to be doing from here on out is I made a new Adobe account on a different email address, and I'm going to be using this as if I was not paying for anything. If you do want to pay for it, I brought up the pricing page here. First up, that $55 a month that I'm paying for Creative Cloud, it is included in that. So if you have the full Creative Cloud, you already have access to this. If you do want to open up those brushes, you can pay $10 a year, which I think is incredibly affordable for what you're getting here. There's some other packages they have as well. Brad from the future here. Quick note that the pricing that I'm showing here is iOS or iPad OS only. On Windows and on Mac, it defaults to the default price Adobe has for apps, which is $10 a month. So that'd be $120 a year to use Fresco on the desktop. But if you're wondering about that free trial, it is identical. The app itself is identical. So you're still going to get all the features in the free trial on the desktop or on iPad OS. If you're on an iPad and you're already using something like Procreate, a lot of the stuff that I'm going to talk about here today is probably already going to be redundant for you. But where I think this app really shines is it's not just available on the iPad, it's available on Windows and Macs as well. Macs, meh, not so much unless you have a touchscreen tablet. But if you have a Windows touchscreen computer that you can draw on, this is really good. Because what it does is it takes that iPad experience and it brings it to Windows. It's hard to find apps that do that really well. Before we get to the next one, I do want to shout out to today's sponsor, Best Buy. Check out this laptop. This is the Lenovo Yoga Book 9i. I've never seen anything like this. Two beautiful OLED displays with a ton of versatility. You can set this up as a standard laptop and use the second screen with a quick 8-finger tap to bring up a digital keyboard and trackpad. Or if you're looking for something a little more traditional, you could just snap on the Bluetooth keyboard that it comes with, and the rest of the screen transitions into a trackpad. You want to dual screen it? Use the included stand. Everywhere you go, you now have two screens to work with. This even works in portrait mode. What about a tablet? They've got you covered. Just fold it all the way back and you're good to go. The Lenovo Yoga Book makes it easier to be productive with applications like Clipchamp and Microsoft Edge, and modern performance with an Intel Evo processor. This is great for creating entertainment or productivity. Have I mentioned the Bowers & Wilkins speakers sound amazing? See my link in the description to pre-order your Lenovo Yoga Book 9i today from Best Buy. Number two are brushes. Now, I already alluded to this, that you can use any Photoshop brush in this program, and that is kind of its superpower. But it's got another kind of brush here called a live brush. So this is a watercolor brush. You may have seen things like this in programs like Rebelle. I think is it called Rebelle Studio, but it has a lot of live like watercolor brushes as well. So you can see the paint flowing through things, and you could actually add water instead of just adding paint and watch it flow on your canvas. So as I add more colors, it starts to do some really interesting things and just blend on its own. Super, super cool. And even though you don't get every brush here, I think that the brushes that they have, whether it's their charcoal, their sketching brushes, their inking brushes, are a pretty complete set. So number 3 is vector brushes. Now, I know I already talked about brushes, but vector brushes are a little bit different. This is something that Procreate doesn't have. I have seen it in apps like Clip Studio, and basically the idea is you can draw with these brushes, but then guess what? You can zoom in. The lines that it ends up leaving are vector lines. What that allows you to do is take your artwork from Fresco into something like Adobe Illustrator pretty seamlessly. Maybe not seamlessly, but pretty well. One thing you're going to notice over here on the side of my screen, over where the layers are, is it's differentiating my layers a little bit. Like this layer where I put the watercolors before, that's got one icon next to it. That means it's a pixel layer, whereas this layer that I am on now has this little circle icon on it. That means it's a vector layer. So if I grab a pixel brush and I start drawing, what it's going to do is it's going to default that brush to my closest pixel layer. This can be a little bit confusing if you have a lot of pixel layers and you don't know which one you're drawing at any time. It's not something that I've run into, but I think if you have a really complicated illustration that's mixing those vector layers and those pixel layers, that is something that could happen. So number 4 is animation. They call it motion here, and I think this is an area where this might actually be better than Procreate. So I've got my sketch down here. It's a man. He's got a fly buzzing around his head. In the lower right hand corner, there is this little icon with circles and a play button. If I tap on that, it brings up some options down along the bottom of the screen. This is basically my animations. The way this differs from Procreate is Procreate takes each layer of your composition and turns it into a frame of animation. Whereas here, I can go to one layer and I can create my animation on that one layer. In short, every layer has its own animations. So if I go down to my options here and I click plus, I'm going to create a new frame. You can see that my fly is a little bit ghosted out, so I'm just going to go in here and maybe I draw some more wings on this fly. I'm going to hit plus again, go in here again and just scribble out my fly really quick and have his wings down. So this is a free 3-frame animation. If I tap on it, I can do a lot of different things. I can duplicate this frame, delete it. I can just copy that frame. Over here in the settings, I can set this to loop, boomerang, or just play once. I'm gonna keep it on the loop, so when those wings hit the bottom, they'll go back up. So let's zoom out a little bit here. I'm gonna hit play, and there we go. My really rough fly is flying. Now, what if I want this fly to fly around his head? Well, what I have to do is I have to figure out, okay, where those wings going to be, and I'm going to draw that fly each place around his head. But Fresco makes that a little bit easier by adding paths. So what is a path? Well, I'm going to tap on this path icon down here, and I'm just going to draw it, and I'm going to draw it in a circle going around his head, kind of like that. And you can see exactly what's happening as this is playing is I'm only animated by hand the actual 3 frames of the fly, and Fresco is taking care of the rest and having that fly around his head. Now, this is why I think it is super duper cool that everything in Fresco is on its own layer, at least every piece of animation is. So what I did is I drew, it might be hard to see here on the screen, but I created a layer with a white block on it, and if I move my flies below that layer like that, and now I hit play, the fly goes in front of the character's head, but then it disappears when it's behind his character's head. By putting everything on its own layer, every animation on its own layer, it lets me do stuff like that, and I think that's pretty darn cool. The next thing I want to talk about are perspective grids. I'm going to go over here under the right hand side, and I'm going to tap on this little grid icon, and there's grid options, and I can turn one on, and here it gives us all of our options. We have a perspective grid. I can go with a graph. I'm going to go back to perspective. And down here, I can choose my vanishing points. Is it 1-point perspective? Is it 2-point perspective? And if I tap on edit, it's going to let me change my vanishing points. In my latest course, I tell my students, hey, if you want to use a perspective grid to do this sort of thing, go ahead. It's going to save you a ton of time. It's hard to find a free app that has a good perspective grid in it. Fresco might be the place to look. So with this grid on, it's really easy for me to just draw on that perspective grid, and I can just come in here and I can rough in my cube. I'm going to quickly get these lines in behind it, but this is so much faster than drawing out your own perspective grid. Super crazy handy. Now, number 6 is Fresco has something called modifier circle, and you're going to see it down here, and if you tap, you can actually hold on the canvas and move that around if it gets in your way. And what this thing does depends on which tool that you have selected. For example, if I'm drawing with an inking tool or most pixel brushes, if I tap and hold on that and continue to draw, what it's going to do is it's going to take that current brush and use that brush as an eraser. It's a shortcut to stuff like that. If you're using a shape tool and you hit the modifier, it's going to do something different. Here, when I'm using the watercolor brushes, if I tap on that modifier, instead of erasing, what it's going to do is it's going to add more water to the canvas. And so instead of using the brush itself, it's just adding more water where that is, causing the paint that's on there to spread out. So the modifier brush is kind of cool. You do have to do some trial and error in there to figure out what it does with each tool, but sometimes it'll surprise you and do something really, really useful. Number 7 is file management. Now, this could be really useful or it might not be useful to you. It depends on your workflow. When I'm working on the iPad, one of the things that is a little bit frustrating is moving layered files, specifically Photoshop files, from somewhere over onto the iPad for Procreate. If I just airdrop those files, what the iPad automatically does is it flattens it into a JPEG and sticks it in my Photos app. Not particularly useful. So you have to save it to something like Drive or Dropbox and then manually share it out to Procreate and import it that way, and it just adds a bunch of different steps. Adobe has tried to make that easier, so anything that I save here in Fresco is just automatically going to show up in my saved documents when I open Photoshop or Fresco on the desktop, which is super crazy handy. And it eliminates all that back and forth that you're always doing with files. Now, the reason I said this might be a downside is if Fresco is the only app you're using and you're not moving that Photoshop file to the desktop to use, say, Photoshop, but you want to move it to Clip Studio or Krita or something else that can open a PSD, you're probably going to run into problems. I want to say problems, but there's going to be some additional steps because you're moving from inside that Creative Cloud ecosystem to the outside of the ecosystem. So there's more steps there. Okay, number 8, the text tools in Fresco work like desktop text tools. I'm glad that Procreate and other apps like that have some kind of text options, but here it just works so much easier. Type on the text tool, put some text in, type in my text, and then I could just resize it, put it wherever I want, and all my settings in Fresco are located in this bar. So sometimes it does get in the way of your composition, but when you need to use a tool that requires more interface elements, this sort of thing comes in really handy. So here I can go in here with the text, and I could select, a font that just looks a heck of a lot better than the one I was using before. The other benefit of Fresco is that it can draw from Adobe's gigantic font library. Here you can see, I think most of these things I already have on my iPad are available for free. However, if you are part of the larger Adobe Cloud Creative System, like you're already paying for that, you get access to fonts, and there is a ton of fonts, and that is a huge benefit. So those are the things I love about Fresco. Like I said before, if you are on a Windows touchscreen device, I really think you should check out Fresco. Even if you're just using the free version, you're still going to get access to pretty much everything. What do you think? Let me know down below in the comments. Thank you all for watching, and I'll talk to you in a couple of days.